All right. Hello everybody. I don't know how to do intros as I just told my new guest here, David. But this is Radio Free Lemuria. So that is the new podcast name. And I do have a guest for the first time on episode. This would be four now. David Patrick Gallagher, who is a friend I've had from online spaces in the lit community for a long time now. And we've been talking about Pynchon for, I don't know. Do you remember how long it's been since we started talking?
I'm truly unsure. I'm guessing it's related to the fact that if I'm remembering correctly, the first time I really read Pynchon, just as a clarification, I read about half of Inherent Vice when I was like 15 and was like, what?
Yeah.
And did not get through it. The first time I really read Pynchon, I think was for like one of the read-alongs we did. I read Lot 49. And I know I like did a write-up for that. I'm guessing that was the outset, though that was
Yeah.
all in the pandemic, and I don't really remember what happened for like most of that.
Yeah, it was the pandemic. I do remember putting that like us putting that little read along together for Lot 49. That was a fun little thing we did. But today we're not focusing on Lot 49 or Inherent Vice, though one day we may be. We're going to be focusing on a very specific 5, 6 pages of Gravity's Rainbow, just after the banana breakfast scene where Pirate had left the banana breakfast because he got a phone call from some mysterious stranger or someone he knew, but who we don't, about a message being dropped off. That message being from the V2 rocket that he watched as it traveled up into the air and back down while he was picking his bananas from his roof to make the banana breakfast. And one thing I want everyone to keep in mind here is the idea of those bananas, because these are all a part of the same chapter. So I do think it all relates together in the end. And one of the first things that stood out to me, it was on page 11, was this one random like little throwaway line. It says, "No, they are making believe to be Narodnik, but I know they are of the Yash of Kodrianu, his men, men of the League." And David, I was wondering, I know we have similar political and historical knowledge, and I was wondering if you knew anything or had anything to say about these two random, I don't know, kind of like forgotten pieces of history, the Nerodniks and Cordianu.
So I'll just say from the start on anything Romanian, I really don't know that much, other than the vaguest of notions that the Iron Guard was one of the more like over the top allies of the Nazis, if that's a possible statement to make. With the Narodniks, strikes me more than anything, like kind of remembering that they are from like early part of the back end of the 19th century, how much it strikes me that they're sort of just after the broader revolutionary period in Europe, which Russia was, to the best of my very limited knowledge, not extremely like involved in. I guess the way to sum it up is I think it's an interesting point for Pynchon to put together because it sort of begins this outset of like what I sort of read as another take on the prospect of socialist revolution in contrast to like 1848. I have to suspect that at least some of the people involved in that really thought that was the big one.
Hmm.
And then, I mean, it was great for some liberals, but
Yeah.
it was really not what like it was certainly not a communist revolution. And I'm wondering in like the realm of Pynchon and how he thinks about everything. The idea of the make-believe Narodnik is sort of showing both like a now we're trying something new, but also the problem of that when they too were not exactly the sort of people who like you're necessarily associating with like a global proletariat revolution. Like these are these intellectuals. The agrarian socialist desires almost remind me more of like pre-Marxist, like utopian socialism and just various back to the land movements that have come and gone over and over and over, even in the Americas, which sort of people took advantage of the space that was being created for settlers to try a variety of weird like utopian experiments here too throughout the 19th century, both pre and post 48. So I'm kind of, if anything, like it stands out to me as a group of like an idea of a pre-Marxist group. And then of course I love that Pynchon is like, and actually there are deeply reactionary implications in the overall back to the land sentiment and the broader sense of we are going to go away from industry and we are going to return, like they're kind of return guys in a
Yeah.
way. But that's like thinking through it now, that's what really grabs me.
Yeah, I pretty much agree completely with the Narodniks. It was interesting looking them up, and then the mention of specifically Cordianu, which I think I'm pronouncing correctly. And for those who don't have the book in front of them, when I said Yash, that is the city spelled Iasi, which I initially thought was spelled or pronounced Iasi. But yeah, I don't speak Romanian, obviously. And so, whereas the Narodniks were some pre-Marxists, pre-revolutionary Marxists who had this sort of utopian idea of agrarian reform and all of that. That was calling back to mind what communism would have been before the actual like October Revolution. This mention of Cordianu was kind of like a pre-Hitlerian fascism because of his rise to power in Romania, where he was a known politician who came to power because he assassinated, I believe it was a police officer, and that led him to being a politician during World War One, like vehemently anti-communist and anti-Semitic, and I mean he was the one who helped form the Iron Guard, or he definitely formed some sort of proto-fascist organization that did lead to a lot of this terrorization of Jewish people and the communists and just a militarized fascist force. And so all of this is kind of, I don't know, you can kind of see a pre-World War II stage that's been set in like the same layers of World War II, where we have these communists and where we have these fascists, just the more forgotten aspects of history in regard to them, rather than like the very blatant American worldview where we see fascism and communism just arrive purely out of World War II. And I feel like Pynchon is bringing this kind of stuff to stage here to show that a lot of it was happening before, whether it was being planned on some grander scale or if it was, I guess I'm trying to say that a lot of people saw these things occurring and then maybe brought them to light to fulfill some of their own desires or their own fantasies, which is what Pirate Prentice is kind of here to help manage.
Sorry, if I could just say one more thing, it just
Mhm.
strikes me now the duopoly of sort of a the way you put it, the proto-Marxist or the ostensibly proto-Marxist who's actually proto-Hitlerian fascist.
Mhm.
It sort of reminds me of the fact that like there was, especially prior to, and this is again a topic that I really should have looked up beforehand, but I'm just thinking about it now. There was so much in pre-World War II, like 20th century Europe, of groups that were sort of like, I think horseshoe theory is not a real thing,
Right.
but but there is sort of interlinkings of groups that at the very least did sincerely think of themselves as socialist in one sense or another, who were actually much closer to being fascist precursors. I mean, the
Mhm.
most, well, right there example is that Mussolini was part of the Socialist Party before he kickstarted Italian fascism, to even like the variety of populist experiments in Germany that certainly had redistributive economic policies, usually at the expense of vitriolic nationalism.
And I think that also kind of just ties into the fact that a lot of this was then co-opted, these kind of links between fascism and socialism, where the Nazis then ended up literally calling themselves the National Socialists. And I think
Yeah.
was it in was it in Mein Kampf that Hitler admitted basically that he called it that to trick people into thinking that socialism was really this fascist ideology. So yeah, lots of pre World War II and pre World War One even links to this idea that would really become fully fledged in World War II. But I guess we can get into what Pirates fantasy management has to do with all of this. And there's also more stuff on Romania and those states. So a lot of this weird history. But I think Pirates Fantasy Management ties into a lot of the stuff we learned later in part one, where there's this group at the White Visitation, a bunch of so-called like quote unquote freaks who have these weird abilities, like one of Cherry Coke's predecessors. One of someone who came after like Wicks, Reverend Wicks Cherry Coke, who's also named Cherry Coke, and a lot of these other ones who have these weird kind of like psychological or spiritual things they can do, and they're known as freaks, and they all get bought up by the SIS, which is like the pre MI6 in World War II, specifically at their base at the White Visitation, where their abilities are then used in order to further capital T their goal. And so, Pirate's ability to infiltrate the dreams and daydreams or fantasies of whoever he wants is one of these kind of like freak abilities that they got him for, or they are using him for. And so he helps manage the fantasies of all of these political figures, because sure, you can maybe use this type of thing for something that's inherently good. I don't know, helping someone out psychologically. I'm sure there's plenty of instances in my life where I was thinking a certain way or having certain fantasies or moping about something where, if I don't know, someone were to get into my head and be like, no, it's really okay, my life would have been a lot better. But alas, of course, capital T, they aren't going to use these abilities for anything that could be inherently good or help the world. Instead, they would be using them for relieving like the stress of political figures by managing their own ideologies for them, which in turn allows us to kind of alter the political fantasies of these people and get them to just do what we really want them to do or make the decisions that we really want them to do. I guess I'm wondering if you have any way to tie this kind of back into Codreanu and the Narodniks, or even moving it a little further forward. There's this mention of Novi Pazar and the adenoid. Do you see how Pirate's ability kind of helped set this stage or make this stage more possible for World War II, or for like the fascist and communist empires isn't the right word. I guess the fascist or communist classes, governments of World War II.
Oh, that is a good question. I guess what stands out to me there is that the way these fantasies are being used, they are just sort of being offloaded so these figures can continue to go about their day. It makes you, I'm almost starting to wonder now, because there is so much fantasy involved in both being an Narodnik or even being Cordrianu, and in general, like fascism relies so much on myth and like various fantasizations of worlds that never existed. It almost makes you think the difference between the Narodniks and like later fascism is that both were fantasists, and one of them was imagining a future they weren't actually going to be able to put together, even if maybe they could be a sort of precursor for, while the other is like fueling themselves on fantasy. And I don't know what exactly, what dreams of fantasy or anything like that Romanian fascism was fueling itself on, like specifically, but just the role of myth and ecstasy in fascism writ large. It does make you think that if they'd been able to tap into the overtly fascist, or if they were able to tap in and actually wanted to manage them,
Right.
as opposed to just letting them do their little thing, there is a world where if you could help divest them of those fantasies and they're forced to come back to the reality where you have to consider the where you have to consider what fascism really is, be it the personalism of the like figurehead leader, right down to whatever myth gets people involved in the first place, like whatever idea of a world they're trying to rebuild that never existed. He might be thinking, like, in theory, you could pull people out of that world if you rethink the fantasies as they stand. But it does make it especially interesting that Pirate, who seems to have a decent amount of control over whose head he's getting into, is never sent to get into their heads.
Mhm. Yeah, I think one of the things that stood out to me is I almost wonder, and I guess it's more of a hypothetical, if Pirate was around during the Narodnik so-called revolution, or if he was hired by the firm during Codreanu's rise, how he would have managed that. Or I don't know, I even start to think like they probably had people who could do this ability before him. And I almost see a sort of firm, a pre SIS firm that saw this kind of thing, like the Narodniks and the revolution they wanted to bring about. And they almost became terrified of the potential of not just the proletariat rising up and wanting a revolution, but actual like upper middle class, upper class intellectuals who are also willing to bring this thing about. And maybe that's why, I guess if I open my book again to the exact line, there was the line that it said, they were making believe to be Narodniks, but I know they are of Yash of Kodrianu, his men. So it's not even just that he's talking about the literal 19th century Narodniks, but he's talking about these fake ones who were really the men of Codrianu. And to me, it seems like they got into the head of the Marxists of the 20th century, the early 20th century, to kind of warp their minds in a way to believe they were some sort of new rising Marxist class or proletariat class, when in reality they were following fascist goals that would only be exacerbated when we had our first true, quote unquote, true fascist in Adolf Hitler.
I'm also realizing it strikes me now that key to how Pynchon describes the purpose of this is so these leaders can get about being the leaders that they're supposed to be. Like they can keep playing their roles instead of living their dreams.
Mhm.
The reason I mention it is that notes near the end of the section that there hadn't been enough focus on the Novi Pazar Bureau since the adenoid problem started up. And also then at the very end, that what Pirate is saving them from
Mhm.
is the Balkan Armageddon the old men dreamed of, giddy in their beds with its grandeur,
Mhm.
though not from World War II, of course. Which is to say, it almost there reads as the firm was trying to let World War II happen by keeping guys from fantasizing about a supposed big to-do that was never actually going to occur. Like whatever Balkan adventurism they'd been hoping for was never going to be more than a dream. And so by Pirate taking that dream off the weight of European progress in scare quotes,
Yeah,
they can get on with what's really supposed to be happening, which is getting Western Europe and then Russia all wrapped up in its own big war.
right. Yeah, and so speaking of Novi Pazar, we can kind of get into that now because I guess we've just focused on one like half sentence that kind of like a throwaway. I always used to think of it as a throwaway line until I was like, I wonder what those two things are, and then
Yeah.
oh my lord, that opened a whole can of worms up. But the adenoid is, I guess, the main focus of this entire section of the book, and so the adenoid, literally unadenoid, is a lymphatic mass which we do see again later in the novel. I think it's in the very last chapter. I think it was a nickname for Richard Nixon or something like that, or that Richard Nixon had an adenoid. Now I'm forgetting. It's been a minute. But this so-called adenoid is not Richard Nixon's adenoid, or maybe it is, but it is a, I don't know, an anthropomorphized adenoid that is rolling through the UK. I don't remember exactly where in the UK, but it was a part of the fantasy of some man named Lord Blatherard Osmo, who was a British governmental figure that the quote is, he occupied the Novi Pazar desk at the Foreign Office, an obscure penance for the previous century of British policy on the European question. For on this obscure Sanjak, maybe that's pronounced wrong, but on this obscure Sanjak had once hinged the entire fate of Europe. And Novi Pazar is specifically the capital of this so-called Sanjak, which was a part of the Ottoman Empire, including a lot of like Africa, Southeast, Southern and Eastern Europe, and the Arabian Peninsula, which meant that this area contained so much culture from Judaism to Christianity to Islam, and then just all of these different sects within sects and all of that. Um, and so this Sanjak or Sanyak, I don't know, was a split region encompassing both Montenegro on the southwest and Serbia on the northeast. And because there was this pretty distinct split, a lot of parties were both guarding this line and people were vying for power to see who could, I guess, rule either the entirety of it or one side of it. I know there are different regions like the Ottomans in Bosnia, Herzegovina, Austria and Hungarians, and then just all these different troops were in the same area, which I could imagine would keep tensions quite high. And speaking of the Austro-Hungarians, this is kind of like where I see the Balkan Wars kind of materializing. The two Balkan Wars that occurred and basically directly led to World War One with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So that's all the history behind Novi Pazar. And I guess my question to you would be, are you able to understand why we're focusing on such another obscure parcel of land from some random dude in a British office, a foreign office, who is trying to man or control this specific area?
I mean, I think a lot of it ties back to two things. I mean, one is just that wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if a lot of the grand scions of colonialism were having a lot of fun.
Mhm.
Like, I think like part of it is like this was supposed to be the next adventure. Like this is the next exotic place we get to cause trouble in.
Mhm.
It also is interesting in the context of both the Balkan Wars causing the a breakdown of Europe and the prospect that you could read World War II as a sort of breakdown of Europe
Mhm.
that I mean, throughout European history, and we can't allow this is an entirely different side tangent. There's a lot of reason to think that, like, the concept of Europe as a coherent entity was so deeply informed by the Crusades, which is to say, the Europe as a singular entity, not that they weren't going to war with each other anyway, but as, like, this Christian whole, the concept of Christendom itself is born out of having an Eastern, as it were, opposition. So it makes you think that, like, after the Ottoman Empire, with the breakdown of that, perhaps the idea here is that, in theory, Novi Pazar is supposed to be the outset of the next big Eastern adventure, one that was not going to come to pass because now we need to loop back into Europe. And I'm not frankly really sure what Pynchon is hinting at here. It almost makes it seem like Europe was destined to turn in on itself in the first place. And by turn in on itself, I mean turn in on itself and begin to rip itself apart. But at the same time, I still can't shake the feeling that the firm wanted this to occur. I mean, I would say in some way, in another, I would say, well, firms make money when the rockets are getting sold. It's definitely something I want to keep thinking through, but it seems like this is sort of supposed to be the last big, exciting moment of a certain mode of colonialism that, well, it would be absurd to, like, I'm not going to say colonialism ended, like, come
Right.
on. But, but that certain, at the very least, one image of what the colonial adventure was or even just how it's remembered afterwards was changing at that point in time. Like this was sort of the last bit of the original dream of Europe is just going to go out and absorb the rest of the world. And, now that I think about it, the Europe's going to go grow like an adenoid upon the totality of the globe at that point. Like this sort of is the last moment of that before, I mean, before World War II got going. Um, Again, I'm not even implying that how that the behaviors within colonies themselves changed at all. Like it was vicious and brutal, and I mean, come on. But at least the way history is remembered, or at least European history, it is very much staged as a this was the colonial period.
Mhm.
This is the period where the two great wars happened. So it seems like at least the European perspective on history would want to tell you that this is sort of a moment when the adventures that get narrated for us now um are going to be adventures that happen within Europe as opposed to those that are happening abroad.
Yeah, I like that, especially you mentioning that like we categorize these things into very specific periods, as if World War One is its own distinct thing when it grew so much out of these Balkan wars, which themselves grew out of, I mean, all of the other stuff happening around the world at the time, all the way back to, again, like the Narodniks and Kodrianu. And all of this stuff is just so tied together that it almost feels absurd to say something like World War One is a direct outcome of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which is, I think, something Pynchon gets at a lot in his discussion of historiography, especially in Mason and Dixon. That's for another time, though.
Yeah.
But I think to me it's interesting thinking that there's this person at the firm managing, or at the, I guess it is the firm, at the foreign office is what I'm trying to say, managing this specific area, and all these histories that we've been talking about, I won't repeat them all again, but there's been a lot of them, all these histories we've been talking about are turning into this sort of adenoid, is the thing that needs to be tamed. And that's the specific thing that Pirate and his fantasy, or his fantasy management ability has come to help manage. And the neurod, or not the neurodnik, the adenoid has been taking over his mind, Lord Blatherard Osmo's mind, leaving him pretty much unable to do his job, which was manage this area. And Pirate comes in, interestingly, with cocaine, and that he determines that that is the way that we can subdue or tame the adenoid, prevent it from growing further, even though it is now just going to sit there as some kind of innocuous being that now just has become naturalized in the whole state of the world. People walk by it and they're used to it now, rather than it growing and being this terrifying force that someone can't comprehend. And so I'm trying to put this together myself. I've been thinking about it, and it's so dense. I think that's the reason that most people give up the book at this specific point, is that it almost doesn't make a ton of sense. But I guess what I'm thinking is his management of the adenoid is what allowed Lord Blatherard Osmo to, I guess, maintain this area on the in the Sanjak region of Novi Pazar, and thus bring about, like we were just talking about, World War One, and eventually World War II. And so I think this is a few things: the discussion of history itself and the impossibility of deciphering all the threads in that area of the world, kind of turning us onto this sort of like straightforward path that a lot of people view history as, which again ties back into what you were talking about, tying things nice and neat up into specific little packages like World War One and World War II, or in Mason and Dixon, a lot of the time it's talking about these like historical chains, that a lot of people view them as just one sort of chain, but in reality, history is a tangle of chains where some chains merge with others, some depart from others, some have no ends, or the ends have been lost and we don't really remember where they are. And so Pirate's management of this mass of history and mass of things almost sets in motion the prototypical person's mind, where history is this straightforward path, allowing someone like Lord Blatherard Osmo to kind of take a step back and be like, man, things aren't really as complex. I think I see the path forward on how we can make history progress as we need it to, or as they, quote unquote, capital T, they need it to.
So I think also it's worth noting who exactly is allowing it to progress, like going back to that idea of what exactly the people whose fantasies are getting managed are being freed up to do. It strikes me, just rereading the section on cocaine, that it isn't pirates specifically who's brought the cocaine. It's
Hmm.
admirers of Dr. Freud the adenoid clearly had no use for,
Hmm.
shoveling the wonder drug cocaine. And I mean, that's just I think as an aside from being just a joke about the fact that Freud genuinely believed in cocaine as a for medical purposes and took quite a bit of it himself and claimed it helped him concentrate. I mean, good for him, I guess. Um, it stands out to me now, just thinking about it, that allowing these fantasies to be tied together so the officials can carry on their specific duties, sort of can be read as a dig at psychoanalysis itself.
Mhm.
Like, and the idea that you have these like upper class people going and talking out their fantasies, their dreams, so they can get back to living their lives in a world where they find themselves getting repeatedly lost in the dream.
Mhm.
It does seem as though like Pynchon is trying to say that both psychoanalysis itself and also like the world in which psychoanalysis is able to exist and become as prominent as it is one to be critical of because it is allowing the construction of that linear trajectory whereby the various threads that could never really be tied together, if they don't get tied together, and there's a case we made that they are getting forcibly tied together if you wanted to take positions against psychoanalysis that I am deeply unqualified to adjudicate on.
Mhm.
But that right there, you see that by allowing the divestment of these fantasies, we can force them into being this singular narrative where things can end and then where the people who are moving history, if not forward in like a normative sense, certainly are making the next things happen or facilitate the next things that did happen, are freed up to get back to their job and stop because they can finally sleep well enough now that they're not dreaming about international adventures.
Right. I think that also just ties back in as kind of one of the when you were talking about the fantasy that basically manages fascism, or the mythology that fascism necessitates or necessitates the existence of. All of these types of fantasies are also this sort of linear history, because we view a lot of these conservative or fascist entities view history as this sort of great man theory, or the Roman Empire having a very specific set of events that went from point A to point B to point C to point D, and they kind of fetishize the idea of a actual narrative, or the possibility that history is just a singular narrative. And that also just ties into this entire idea again. There's like 8 definitions of fantasy that we're going with here, and I really do think it pirates management of these fantasies encompasses pretty much all of them, whether it's history or the fantasy of fascism or mythology, or the linearity, quote unquote linearity of history. And did you have anything to like add to pirate and the adenoid before we kind of like talk about what this sort of thing means for the novel, which people would call it postmodernism? So I think one of the biggest points is a lot of people talk about postmodernism in this novel being like the or postmodern novel because of, I don't know, all the digressions and the seemingly pointless jump off points that Pynchon takes. And to me, I think that postmodernism, if you can call it that, I have my own gripes with postmodernism, or even more horrifying of a word, postmodernism now. When people talk about postmodernism, I kind of, the thing that comes to my mind is this bundle of information. The example in my life itself being postmodern is I wake up and I sometimes look at my phone right away, which I shouldn't, and see horrible things happening around the world. And I come downstairs and sometimes listen to a podcast, and that's information being put into my head. Sometimes I'll be on the bus and someone will be listening to something, or I'll be in my car and I'll be listening to some music. I'll be at school and I'll be hearing all of these people's opinions or things they had heard on the news. And it's postmodernism is this condition we live in where all this information is being thrown at us, and it becomes so impossible to decipher and impossible to like pick out what reality is in the situation in which we live. And that also ties back into the idea of linear history versus history of bundled chains. But I think it's become even far more prominent now, obviously, because of the information age, be it radio, TV, advertising, the vast amount of movies and books and TV shows and music we have access to, and all the people and news we can see around the world. And I feel like a lot of this has to do with that, because as the book progresses, knowing that Pirate has this ability to manage people's fantasies, especially when we get introduced to Slothrop, who has these completely absurd, cartoonish jaunts forward where he is going on a railroad chase through the Nazi tunnels in the Mittelwerk, or where he's having a pie fight in the sky and hot air balloons. All of these things are completely ridiculous and theatrical and seem like they're coming out of a movie. And to me, maybe they are, because maybe it is the fantasy that someone like Pirate Prentice is having. And then I start to wonder, is this fantasy that not Pirate Princess is having, that Slothrop is having, sorry, these crazy things are this fantasy that Slothrop is having. And I start to wonder, is Pirate managing Slothrop's fantasies? Are Slothrop's fantasies him trying to figure out what is going on in the world and how all this tangle of webs comes together to have caused World War II and led to these intelligence agencies controlling the world and led to the Nazis being subdued, but then not really. And Slothrop is trying to figure this all out, and Pirate is in his mind. And I wonder, is Pirate leading him to a series of thoughts that Pirate wants him to be at? Is Pirate kind of just watching on the sidelines, and what we're seeing is Slothrop's genuine fantasies without any sort of interference? Or is this actually happening? And the answer is who knows, because I think that's the point. That's what postmodernism is this tangle of possibilities and this tangle of all this information coming in at once that we literally have no clue what's real and what's not. And I guess that's what my reason is for thinking this sort of adenoidal creature and Pirate's fantasy management ability. That's why it's put here at the beginning of the novel, to put that idea into our head and to make us really think, what the hell is real, as the book progresses.
That is sort of, and if this sounds too off track, feel free to let me know, but I think it's related. One of the questions I've had a few times reading Gravity's Rainbow is, why is it a novel?
Mhm.
Like, when you think about, like, Pynchon seems to have convictions that he's trying to express and maybe even in theory get realized through the work. The book is, if nothing else, like a great, like the barest minimum you could say about the political value of it is that in theory, someone could read this book and think, there was a lot of interesting shit in here. Oh,
Mhm.
geez, sorry.
Oh, you're allowed
Um,
to cause, don't worry.
okay, good. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. I should look into some of it. And in theory, it could radically change one's worldview to dig into every single thread throughout this book and like come away from like the various histories he's giving you to work with. At the same time, you could ask the question, why not just try to become a historian
Mhm.
or like someone producing pop works of pop lefty history? Like,
Mhm.
why not try to do a whole Howard Zinn thing for that matter? Like, what is the what is it about postmodern fiction that does so often seem tapped into the political questions of its time? Not that any fiction ever hasn't been, but it certainly seems to me to be the case that the postmodern novels that are most popular are also ones where it's very easy to notice for like a person in our time how they're talking about the politics of our time. And that's purely just because of recency. Like we can understand the political context in a way we can't understand the political context of other moments, even like something as recent as Ulysses, we're just not going to have, if you're just some random schmuck reading the book, an immediate knowledge of what was going on there. And maybe it can make it easier to miss the politics baked into there. I guess to go back to that question of postmodern fiction and trying to keep all these threads together when they can't be.
Mhm.
My thought on it now, reading this, is that I think this could be considered like the importance of pirate and even the unknowability of what exactly happens next and whether is this real? Is it fantasy? is Pirate the narrator of the rest of the book? That's like
Hmm.
one of those questions people toss around. And actually, to be honest, after this read, I'm more convinced that that's onto something than I've ever been before. I almost wonder if like the purpose Pirate and the Adenoid are serving is almost to outline what is happening in the rest of the book and pointing towards what exactly is up. Um, as I commented on your excellent last episode, I said something to the effect of the book is the adenoid growing and consuming a history that won't stop blathering on, blatherard.
Right.
Um, and Prentice is Pynchon interpreting the gurgles for the rest of us, who I'm now very worried of the firm. Little concerned about that one.
Hmm.
I think it sort of ties in with the great point you made there that Pirate is simultaneously not, by any account, an awful guy and also on the wrong side of this. Like he's complicit, even if he is also like seems like a decent enough chap if you set aside the well, what he does for a living.
Right.
Um, I think what I'm sort of getting at is it seems like what Pynchon is trying to do in setting a course here for something like a postmodern fiction, if we want to say this is the first postmodern novel, which I think risks stumbling into the history is a line fantasy that we've all been living in anyway. Um, that what he's trying to set out is that it isn't possible even to speak of reality from a singular perspective, or at least it's completely and utterly impossible to get at everything that way. Um, and if you're going to try to get at everything, it can only be by sort of trying to absorb reality and steal it from that which hasn't ended yet in his case. It almost feels like he's trying to tap into a sort of like collective unconscious to steal words from guys who I started reading last week.
Hmm.
Um, but it seems like the way I've been reading this time is that Pirate is trying to mediate for himself, for someone. Maybe it is just for himself, so he doesn't lose it altogether. Pirate is trying to mediate everything that is happening in Europe at once in in the time the book is set, in the time the book is written, in the various other times the book hints at, like when we got lost in the Narodniks and who they actually were for so long. Um, and that Pirate, by trying to absorb all of that into himself and set it forth, you're not going to get a linear narrative, but you are going to get something that hints towards comprehension, where you can see that even if there isn't a singular narrative, there is an entire web, or I like to use the word constellation for these things. I believe I'm plagiarizing that from Theodore Adorno, maybe? I don't know. But sorry, I'd like to cite my sources. I just think that what he's doing here is that he is creating a sort of chart by which you can come to understand a world that exceeds any sort of possibility of narrating it in and of itself. And I think there's a banal take on that when you start thinking about the purpose of fiction, where the answer is, yeah, so the reality is to understand the world, you can't read a single book, you need to read 28 of them. And I agree with that, to be sure. Read history, know things. Like,
Hmm.
I'm very pro that. I've been doing a lot of it lately. Also, just that maybe by still trying to tap into all of it at once, there is something that can be gotten at, whether it's just the full interlinkages or that there is just value in the beauty of getting to this. Like, it's a fun read.
Hmm.
Like, I don't
Yeah.
know. Sorry if this is getting a little unclear at this point.
No, I agree because I think that one of the biggest points of this novel is that Gravity's Rainbow is using the end of World War II, the 1944, 1945, mostly to talk about the 1960s as a whole, with all of these sort of things like bringing up LSD very often, bringing up cocaine, bringing up sort of the hippie movements, and bringing up people smoking joints. Like, who, I don't remember who it was. It was the people who debate Beethoven and Rossini smoking joints together. But there's all these little hints at that this book is really trying to get at the era that Pynchon was writing Gravity's Rainbow in, being the 1960s rather than just the 1940s. And if we have to understand the 1940s to understand the 1960s, then why would we not have to understand the extinction of the dodo birds to understand genocide as a whole? And why would we not have to understand this interweaving of history, or Latin American banana republics, or any of this stuff that's brought up in the novel that seems to be a digression? It's not a digression. It's just that that's how we understand the world around us. We can't just read history. And again, we should read history, even though people have yelled at me for wanting to read just a typical history textbook. I mean, we have to understand the traditional narrative in order to like kind of start making jumps around and understanding what the real narrative is, quote unquote real narrative. But we need to understand all these different digressions that Pynchon is talking about, because there's really no other way to comprehend history or to make sense of it or to have opinions about it. But I guess to finish up, Slothrop's quest is managed by, potentially is managed by Pirate. And one of the last things I want to say is that I think maybe that is why the quest starts to dissolve near the end. And at this point, if you haven't read the book and you hate spoilers, maybe you can hop off, but there's not really going to be true spoilers. But I think his Slothrop's quest post Anubis, post his most horrific scene, is when the book starts to dissolve. And I almost wonder if that's Pirate letting go of Slothrop, no longer managing his fantasy, or perhaps taking hold in order to manage it for a better cause. Since where Slothrop ends up at the end of the novel, even though he kind of dissolves into nothingness, it is a better place than he was heading toward at the beginning of the novel. And I think that is maybe Pirate coming to terms with his ability can be used for good potentially, where he's forming this counterforce and having these real revolutionary ideas. And maybe that's what we're seeing there. I don't know. Do you have anything to say about that before we kind of hop off?
Well, honestly, I'm mostly just like thinking that I've never had the thought pass through my head that what is happening at the end of the book is Slothrop finally seizing back the narrative, by which the narrative is entirely breaking down beyond even how fragmented it already was. I've never considered it on those terms before, so I'm mostly just like, wait, now that makes some good amount of sense. So I'm a little just stunned at how much I like that idea.
Hmm.
Um, I think it is interesting, and there's side tracks you could get at here about I that I don't think are worth getting into, but are worth continuing to chew on regarding letting the book almost fail to achieve what a novel is supposed to.
Hmm.
Like, and just that the victory of this book is that it winks out in an apocalyptic way, but at the same time, the ending only in certain ways carries on with the rest of the book.
Hmm.
So it both falls apart and explodes, to
Hmm.
get a little too literal. I don't know, like I think it's an interesting way of thinking about where we're taking fiction and what exactly is operating there. But again, I just never thought about that with Slothrop before, and I like it a lot, and I need to read the rest of the book with that prospect in mind, so to work through that one before I can say much more.
Hey, I mean, I kind of came up with that on the fly because of the conversation we've been having and just thinking about pirates. So I, as well, am gonna have to be taking that through the rest of my read. And with that, I just want to remind everybody to not forget that this takes place in the same chapter as the banana breakfast sequence, which at the time Pynchon was writing this in the 70s was kind of maybe one of those more obscure parts of history. It's not so much anymore. That is something we thankfully know more about as opposed to the Narodniks or Kodrianu. But it's taking place during this because we are, I think Pynchon's also putting this at the beginning of the novel to show us that he is going to be revealing to us all these forgotten parts of history, and to keep an eye out for them because history is made up of these forgotten parts of history. History is not one narrative, it's overlaps and Venn diagrams and all these things layering over each other. And that's what he's trying to show us is, or trying to point us toward some sort of truth, whether that's possible or not. I don't know, but I've probably gotten more truth out of Pynchon than I have out of any other writer that I've ever read. And so that would be the end of the episode. Did you have anything that you wanted to plug, or I know you have a book?
Sure, thanks. If you want to let me
Yeah,
talk about myself for a minute. I mean,
sure.
first of all, thank you everyone, both Andrew and anyone who listens to this for bearing with me. I have never been on a podcast before, and I hope whatever just occurred was enjoyable or at least manageable in a Pirate Prentice fashion.
Yes.
Um, as far as me and my nonsense, I published a novel with the online publisher Ephesus Press. It's called Spree with a little exclamation point. That's Ephesus.press. Little inside bit. The publisher, the first time they read a draft of the novel, called it like Thomas Pynchon riding a bicycle. Make of that what you will, though I am pro pension and pro bicycle. So if that appeals to you, feel free to take a peek. Beyond that, if you're curious about what I'm up to now, the website slantedmagic.neocities.org is my latest terrible silly project where I log my current activities, let's call it. Some new writing up there, some stuff I'm working on, various weird doodles because I like to draw shirts for people. Yeah, I don't know. That's my nonsense. Thanks for all of this, Andrew. This is so great. Like some of the best work on Pynchon I've listened to in a while. Like so much of it at this point, like I listen to podcasts all the time. It's a problem. I shouldn't do it. I should go out and touch grass. But with that in mind, I'm almost surprised I can still be learning so much from a podcast about Thomas Pynchon. And yet here I am on a podcast about Thomas Pynchon, having my mind blown about what Slothrop is up to and how he works.
Yep.
Um, which is just to say, this is so awesome. I'm so excited you're doing this. And thanks again for having me on.
Well, thank you as well. And we will see how Slothrop works next chapter because we get to look at his desk in depth. So that's a nice little segue into the coming episode, which I don't know if you intended that, but it's pretty perfect.
No.
So thank you so much for being on the podcast, David. And maybe we should do this again sometime. But uh,
Happy to.
yeah, of course. So with that, the next episode will be on part one, chapter three, which is a very short chapter. And so I will see you for that one when it happens. Thank you.